My name's Helene and I am now 52 years old, and I was born in 1965. I was actually born in Edinburgh in Scotland, but then when I was 2 we moved to Norway, to Bergen. I grew up in Bergen from when I was 2 till I was 9 years of age, but we lived outside Bergen near the fjord, so it was rural. We spent most of our time during the day playing outdoors, learning to swim in the fjord and building rafts, and very free childhood. And then when I was 9 we moved to Trondheim, which is the third largest city in Norway, sorry. Trondheim is the third largest city in Norway, and I lived there till I was 15 years of age when we moved to Scotland. So generally I had, I think Norwegian childhood still very much are like that, where you actually see children making their own way to school, playing outdoors, little parental supervision with playing. And from what I can remember, not that big a difference between boys and girls in terms of what we did. Yes, I had dolls, and my brothers might have had cars, but I remember together we made, what they called it in English, go-karts. It was like boys and girls would build rafts together, make go-karts, build dens. I can't remember there being much of a differentiation between girls and boys when we grew up, in terms of what we did and how we played. And I was a tomboy, you know. I wanted short hair. I ran around topless continually, not in my teens, but until I was about 8 or 9 years of age. I wasn't into pink things or dresses. But I think children tend to be quite stereotypical in how they see things. And they want to categorise everything. And one of the ways in which they categorise things now seems to be in relation to what a boy thinks and what a girl thinks. Why they've become more so now than when I grew up, I don't know. I just think we should chill a lot more about these things. You know, if girls want to play with Barbie dolls and boys want to play Ben 10, so what? But similarly, you know, one of my nephews, I remember, because his best friend was a girl when he was at nursery. So I remember at 4 years old, he was telling me that what he wanted more than anything for his birthday was a Barbie doll. And his mother was saying, "Are you sure you want a Barbie doll?" And he was adamant he wanted a Barbie doll. And I took him to see his other 2 nephews just after Christmas, and they were like, "What did you get for Christmas?" And he said, "A Barbie doll." And they went, "Yuck!" And since then he never played with his Barbie doll again, and I just thought, oh, that's a bit sad. But we should chill about, I really think overall we should chill about these things a lot more. It's not going to determine how they turn out later on. Whatever they want to play with, let them play with it. My Scottish grandmother, she was a nurse, and my Scottish grandfather was a doctor. So they're more sort of stereotypical gender jobs that they had. And my Norwegian grandfather was a pharmacist, and my Norwegian grandmother was a housewife, stayed at home. Whilst my parents, yes, my father was the main breadwinner. And when we were very young, it was my mother who took the years out. She had 5 children quite quickly, took a few years out away from employment. But by the time I, middle childhood, my mother was working full-time as well. And so chores in the house and everything were very much shared. Although they were shared fairly equally, I would say, between my mother and father, but also between the older children. You know, we had to take responsibility for cooking and baking and tidying up and doing the ironing and such like. So over the generation, yes, there's been a change from quite gender stereotypical roles to, with my parents, them by the time we were 5 or 6 years of age, both working full-time and both actually going quite far within their field, and recognised as such. Well, teenage life for me was very messed up. I weren't completely off the rails as a teenager coming to Scotland. And I think it would have been a fairly awful time for my mother. So, I mean, she would have known most of the things that I was up to as a teenager. I can't remember to what extent pregnancy was a preoccupation. My best friend at school in Norway, she did get pregnant at 15 years of age. But it wasn't, can't remember it being a main concern for me. But I got myself into a lot of situations that I just think about with horror now. And I sometimes do, you know, the way things are discussed, I sometimes think, should I think back at this and consider these experiences and think about whether could it have damaged me in some kind of way? And I just, every time my conclusion is no. I sort of think that we have this one time on planet Earth, and you know, we go from life to death, and inevitably we are going to have experiences that are really awful along the way. It is inevitable. And so we have a choice about how we deal with that. That we just say, right, I'm just going to brush that under the carpet and forget it ever happened and get on with my life and not let it define me. Or shall I go back and rethink it and think about how in that situation I was a victim of some fairly horrific experience. Most of those experiences, I think, I put myself in those situations. So I always come to the conclusion, no, I don't want to revisit it. I don't want to go into detail of anything that happened to me in my teenage years. I'd rather just forget about a lot of those situations. They don't have to define you. And you learn something from it. You learn something from those experiences. You learn sometimes that people look out for you. There are some who take advantage, but the vast majority actually look after you. I mean, the amount of times I think I got myself into situations that I might not have survived, but there was always somebody there for me, male or female. We've got to enjoy the time we have on planet Earth. We have to make the most of it. And why make yourself unhappy by going back? And actually, you know, you might be reinterpreting it because our memory is not that reliable. And I sometimes think, I mean, that really was quite bad what happened to me, but could it be that I have imagined it differently from what it... I don't know 100% whether it did happen the way I remember it now. And so I think there's a danger. I mean, why go and dredge up these things from the past? Who does it help? What purpose does it serve? Well, and why not remember all of the wonderful things people have done for you rather than try and remember all of the bad things that human beings might have done to you in the past? But I just think the vast majority of men don't behave badly. So there's a general message that's coming across with this, which is one of that we should be suspicious of male motives, even when, you know, their motives might be in no way malicious. And sometimes they might, yes, sometimes I think it's irritating if you think somebody is your friend, say, you have no idea that there was anything else going on between the two of you, and then suddenly they make a move on you. I remember being so indignant, you know, particularly if it was friends, like, what on earth made him think that I was interested? But, you know, misunderstandings happen, and it's really quite unfair on the men, because if I happened to have that glimmer of interest in that person and didn't show it in any way, and then they showed interest, I'd be very, very flattered. But if I didn't have that glimmer of interest, I'd feel insulted. And I sort of think that's a bit unfair, isn't it? I'm all for people being more polite. I don't like people not being polite, but I would be concerned about the passion side and the I mean, intimacy and love is only achieved, I think, through opening yourself up and becoming vulnerable to that other person. It often involves testing of boundaries, so hurt feelings. And I was terrified when I grew up of hurt feelings, so I had a massive shell around me. So I didn't let anybody get too close to me. And I think that stunted my development to some extent, because I think you only really learn about yourself and others through that real intimacy that you get with another person. And that's maybe why I went a bit out of control with drink and drugs, and then end up in situations where I didn't know quite how I'd ended up in those situations. I generally wasn't that good at standing up for myself either, but the thing is, I had female friends who would often say to me, God, you are naive. You're naive putting yourself in that situation, but they would be there for me. So I do think we've got to bear in mind that women are different. Some are far better at standing up for themselves. I'm sure you were in your teens a lot better than me. But we look out for each other, don't we? And on the whole, I think the vast majority of men are decent. It does concern me a lot, the way in which boys are presented as potential predators. Because I think it's inevitable, particularly early on when you're dating, when you first, fall in love with a girl and, want her to be your girlfriend, or a girl falls in love with a boy. It's, open to misinterpretation. And it worries me a lot the way things are, with the way boys in particular are presented today at school and at university. I mean, the discussion that goes on about peer-to-peer sexual abuse in schools, and looking at some of the government reports and looking at what some of the NGOs say around this, it horrifies me, because they do not differentiate between what I would consider as sexual abuse and what is just childish behaviour, or, testing, is the girl interested, not quite sure how to show you that you're interested, so you might ping her bra or touch her in some kind of way. A lot of these things were presented as examples of sexual abuse. So it does really worry me, having a son, that he could end up being paralysed, not knowing, well, what are you allowed to do and what are you allowed to say in front of a girl. And I've got a number of my friends have got children who are older, so they've been through university. And I've heard some horror stories about boys at university. They've got friends who have ended up where the police turn up, where something that they thought was a consensual act was then, because they'd both had a bit too much to drink, was then turned into something that wasn't consensual, because the girl had had a few drinks, but so had he. They'd both had a few too many drinks, the kind of things that our generation, we got ourselves into situations like that. We didn't then point the finger and say, well, it's your fault to the boy that I've ended up in a situation I now regret. So it worries me a lot how life is going to be like for my son. I don't like the calls for more protection for girls at all. I was discussing this with some of my students today, who are mature students, and they were saying, what kind of ways are these calls? And I said, right, for instance, Jeremy Corbyn talked about having maybe train carriages that are women only. There's talk about, possible chaperones for girls and such like. They were shocked. They said, well, that's like going backwards to them. And it is like going back to the Victorian time where, these pathetic, rather weak women. When I grew up, I did not want to be treated any differently from a male at all. And most of the time, I didn't feel like I was treated differently from males. The one time where I really thought, oh, I've been treated differently because I was a woman, and was really offended, was when I was invited on Start the Week. and there were 3 other males there, and there was me, and they let slip that could I come up with some other suggestions because they really need some more women on the show. And I realised then that I was the token woman. I was, and I was really offended. And I sort of realised now, well, actually, I had no right to be offended because I was on with Nicholas Heitner, who's run a theatre, and they were, in a far better place to be selected for to come on Start the Week than myself. But so there it was like I was invited on because they wanted a, gender balance. But I can't remember many situations growing up where I thought I was treated differently there because of being a woman or a girl. Our parents didn't think, the 3 older girls needed any more protection than the boys, whether that's to do with the fact that we were the 3 older ones and therefore seen as more competent. But there was never this sort of sense, well, you're the girl, so you can't, wander the streets late at night, and you should be treated any differently from a boy. In terms of the gender balance in the home and childcare issues, I do think, for me, I had children later in life and I adopted them. So I made a conscious decision that I wanted to play quite a large part in their life. So yes, my husband is mainly the breadwinner. And for the first few years when they were with us, I did very little work and was very much part of their life. But yes, in terms of my life and noticing the difference between men and women, it's the one area I think where that's what is expected. I do see a gender difference there in terms of picking the children up from school, getting them to school, thinking about their sports activity. Yes, it's shared to some extent, but I do feel I'm mainly responsible. Whether that's me imposing it, or whether that's the expectation, it's difficult to tell. But I think that is one of the challenges for women, though, in choosing to have a family, is the expense of childcare. Because I didn't want to fall off the career ladder. So I wanted to carry on with my teaching and think about my career as well. But that was the biggest challenge. There was the childcare, the expense of childcare, the difficulty of which my parents didn't have because they didn't have to be at home when we were at home. When I still lived in Bergen, so I would have been 9 and Karen would have been 11, we would babysit for the 3 younger children. So parenting wasn't as intensive, it wasn't as much of a full-time job that you had to be there and look after the children constantly. There's much more pressure on women now, I think, to turn out the perfect child. So I think that's maybe the one area where there is a difference between men and women. Well, I teach psychology, and it tends to be heavily weighted towards female students. So it's not an area where I would say you would want any kind of campaign to get more female students. It's very much weighted towards females. I would say that I don't think psychology is particularly pushed to girls, but the American students I teach, I would say for every this is a bit, I haven't looked at all of the figures, but I would say for every 15 females there'll be 1 male. And actually that's because I teach developmental psychology, which is to do with child development, and maybe there are some areas of psychology like forensic psychology that might attract more males. But but I don't think it's pushed in any way. I think it's a choice that people make. I don't know enough about all the sciences of such, but my impression is that things are actually evening out quite a lot. I mean, there was a big difference when I grew up. Just maths was seen as the male subject. I don't know if it is anymore amongst secondary school pupils. I think these things change through osmosis, development. There aren't barriers put in place of women doing whatever they might want to do, in the same way that we didn't have that many barriers. My parents' generation would have had more barriers, and my grandparents' generation many, many, many more barriers, where it was just not expected that they should go to university. You train the men up to be pharmacists within the family, and the women are at home. Or my Scottish grandmother, yes, a man's the doctor and the woman's the nurse. Are men and women equal in terms of opportunities? On the whole, I think yes. I think the one area where there will be a difference is within the family and raising the children. I think it's very hard to work out to what extent is that due to cultural expectations and what extent is that due to your personal choice. Because your personal choice sometimes comes out of what is expected of you culturally. And I would want to say that, well, it was my personal choice. I should be the one who'd be around for the children. But maybe that's because underlying it all, I think that's what's expected of me. So it's very hard to say what it is. But we've got to accept as well that there is an element to which some women choose that they don't want to put everything into their career. And one could easily say, are men restricted because there's this expectation that they should be the one who'd want to move up the ladder of promotion and put all their energies into their career and not into the family. So maybe they're being a disadvantage to some extent as well. I did think about recently, I did put some thought into whether I had ever seen myself as a feminist. And why not? Because, I think I was a sort of liberal lefty in my teenage years. And there were certain causes I felt very strongly about, particularly racism. But for some reason that feminism never appealed to me, and I don't know why. I don't know whether it just didn't ring true, that there were these great differences between men and women. So it was just not something that I ever identified with. I never identified with feminists. And I can't quite put my finger on why. Now I can, put my finger on why I don't like feminists now. I don't like their celebration of victim mentality. I don't like the talk about going back to protecting women. And they seem to want to create this difference between men and women. Well, I always saw, that wasn't the biggest, when I look at a person, gender was not a big defining thing for me. And it seems now the more obsessed we are with doing away with gender, the more obsessed we seem to be with gender. Something that didn't seem to impact that greatly on my life when I grew up. Now it's like all this obsession with not being binary. Well, I grew up as a girl, but I hung around a lot with boys and had short hair. It didn't mean that I thought, oh right, no, I don't want to be a girl, I want to be a boy. That didn't seem to matter that much. I was who I was.
That's really good. You're very good. You're very eloquent.
No,
yeah, you're really entertaining to watch.
You are.
That's really
Yeah, no, you can see everyone's going to be like this.
I hate seeing myself on TV, so just minimise my clips, will you?
No.
But Camille Paglia's point, I think, is very good about, you know, some of the worst jobs around, men are expected to do, not women. And I'm just reading Emil Zola on Germinal on the miners and the miners' strike, and not long before that I read George Orwell on The Road to Wigan Pier. And it really is quite shocking how tough the work was down the mines. And yes, okay, through the ages women have had it hard, but men have done some horrendous jobs and still do. You know, going out in the middle of the night to do construction work or work on the roads, or and you think, you know, some of this back-breaking work, yeah, they deserve to get higher pay for that than work that is not as back-breaking. But also the thing that really struck me reading those books is the work might have been really hard, but they could take that in their stride. And, you know, George Orwell talks about some of the miners. He almost talks about them as Greek gods, because he has one day working with them and he just cannot imagine that they can do that day in and day out, where you're gasping for breath, where you're coughing up soot afterwards. He says they do that, and they do that with dignity, and they day in and day out, that they can cope with. He says the thing that is soul destroying is when they get injured or retired, can't work, and then can't support their family, and their manhood and their dignity and everything is taken away from them. So that is something I think historically, you know, the burden has been on men. If the family is starving, it's your fault. You are the one who has to provide for the family. Or where, even if nobody's pointing the finger at you for the fact that they're starving, it is one of a complete failure on your part that they would feel. I think these changes can be quite hard for individuals, and things do not change overnight. And there will be certain societal expectations, and there will be certain expectations that you have on yourself. So if you are a male and unemployed, it might take far more of a toll on your self-esteem, your self-respect. If you have children who, you know, you could hardly clothe or can't provide for in the way that you want, it may still be harder for a man than a woman. And it would take a while for those societal expectations to change, I think. Because historically the man was meant to be the breadwinner and the woman was there to look after the home. And yes, these things change, but they take a while. And that change might be quite hard for some individuals to negotiate. It might be hard for men to negotiate in some way. It might be hard for women to negotiate in some way. But we need to have a proper, serious discussion and not finger-pointing about these things. I mean, I don't know if it matters if there's generally certain things that are associated with being male and certain things associating with being a female. Is that a problem? Not if it's completely acceptable to go beyond those expectations. So, I mean, I sort of often think about the idea that you don't want to identify as a woman, or say you don't want to identify as a man because you like wearing high heels and a dress and such like. But Prince and Bowie experimented with what they wore and how they were, but without having to change the fact that they were men. So I'm not sure whether I think we want to get completely away from the idea that we have men and women, but I think we should be quite relaxed about, you know, if you're a woman, you may have lots of male interests. You may want to do what is seen as a masculine job. You might have femininity and masculinity, but you might not neatly fit into that just because you're a male or a female. But on the whole, I generally think we should chill a lot more about these issues. And not, yes, get away from the idea of a war. It seems so counterproductive.
Uncut.
Brava.
No.